Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling a question that has captivated historians and writers and dreamers for centuries. Was King Arthur real? We've got a mountain of sources to dig through: historical accounts, archaeological reports, and even some literary analysis, all to help us separate the Arthur of legend from the potential Arthur of history.
Yeah, it's a fascinating puzzle, isn't it? You've got this figure who straddles the line between myth and reality, and trying to unravel that mystery is like peeling back layers of time.
Exactly. So to kick things off, let's transport ourselves back to 5th and 6th century Britain. Rome's gone, leaving a power vacuum and a very vulnerable island. And into this chaotic scene step the Saxons, who, as we know, weren't exactly known for their peaceful diplomacy.
Not at all. Imagine the desperation of the Britons. Gildas, a 6th century monk, describes this era in his work on the ruin and conquest of Britain. And let me tell you, he doesn't sugarcoat it. He paints a picture of utter chaos with British leaders squabbling amongst themselves while the Saxon threat looms large.
He even describes these desperate pleas the Britons sent to Rome, known as the groans of the Britons, begging for military support.
And Rome, dealing with its own internal struggles, essentially says, sorry, you're on your own. It's the perfect breeding ground for a hero to emerge, someone to rally the Britons and push back against the Saxon invaders. Enter King Arthur.
Well, that's what we're here to find out. But here's where it gets really interesting. Gildas, who was writing just decades after the supposed Battle of Badon Hill, this major British victory that's supposedly halted the Saxon advance, mentions a heroic leader. But it's not Arthur. He praises Ambrosius Aurelianus, describing him as the last of the Romans, who rallies the Britons and leads them to victory. It makes you wonder if maybe, just maybe, some of Ambrosius's story got woven into the later Arthur legend.
It's a possibility, and it highlights how these stories can evolve over time, but the silence about Arthur in these early accounts is definitely intriguing. If he was this legendary warrior king, why wouldn't Gildas have mentioned him?
Right. It makes you wonder if maybe we're dealing with a case of history being written by the victors, or perhaps stories evolving as they're passed down through generations. It's like a historical game of telephone. Speaking of which, we also have Bede, who wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English people in the 8th century. What does he have to say about Arthur?
Bede unfortunately follows Gildas's lead. No mention of Arthur, just Ambrosius Aurelianus as the hero of Badon Hill. So for two pretty reliable early sources, Arthur is a no-show. So if we're looking for the first mention of our mysterious king, we have to fast forward to the 9th century to a work called The History of Britain by a Welsh monk named Nennius. And this is where things start to get decidedly more legendary.
Oh, Nennius.
Yeah.
He's the one who finally gives us Arthur by name, right?
He does. Nennius credits Arthur not only with the victory at Badon Hill, but with 11 other battles as well. He even gives him the title Dux Bellorum, which means war leader. Now, what's fascinating about that title is that it actually harkens back to the Roman military structure. So you have this hint of historical grounding, a connection to that Romanized Britain we talked about earlier.
So maybe this link to Rome could explain why the name Lucius Artorius Castus, a Roman military officer from a much earlier period, gets tossed around as a potential real Arthur.
It's an intriguing connection, isn't it? Even though the timelines don't quite match up, the fact that the name pops up centuries later suggests that there might be some deeper cultural memory at play.
Okay, I'm sensing a but coming.
Yeah.
Because Nennius also tells us that Arthur single-handedly killed 960 Saxons at Badon Hill.
Exactly, and that's where we start to see the embellishment, the blurring of history and myth, even for the most skilled warrior that claim pushes the boundaries of believability.
It's like, come on, Nennius. Even we know that's a bit much. Then, to add another layer of mystique, the Welsh annals from the 10th century claim that Arthur carried the cross of Christ on his shield at Badon Hill.
Talk about upping the hero factor. It's a powerful image linking Arthur to divine protection and elevating him to almost saintly status. It begs the question, if Arthur was so extraordinary, why this silence in earlier records? Is this a case of his story evolving over time, or are we seeing the deliberate construction of a national hero?
Right, it really makes you think about how history is often a combination of fact interpretation and maybe even a bit of wishful thinking. So let's dive into some of the possible historical figures who have been put forward as the real Arthur. We already touched on Lucius Artorius Castus, the Roman officer, but what about some of the other contenders? I'm ready for some theories.
Well, get ready for a whirlwind tour of 5th and 6th century Britain. Besides Lucius Artorius Castus, who, as we mentioned, lived a bit too early for our timeline, there's Riothamus, a 5th century British king who fought against the Goths. But in Gaul, not Britain. Right time period-ish, but wrong location.
So close yet so far. It's like history is playing a game of almost, but not quite. Who else is on the list?
We can't forget Ambrosius Aurelianus, Gildas's hero, who some scholars believe might have been Arthur's father. That would explain Arthur's later prominence, building on an already heroic lineage. Then there's Arthur MacAden, a 6th century Scottish prince, right time period, but again, wrong region.
Okay, so we've got a Roman officer, a British king who fought in Gaul, a potential father, and a Scottish prince. It seemed like none of these candidates quite fit the bill perfectly. What does that tell us about the search for the real Arthur?
I think it highlights the challenges of working with fragmented historical evidence. We're piecing together a puzzle with missing pieces, and sometimes it's more about finding the best fit rather than a perfect match.
It's like those based on the true story movies where they take a kernel of truth and then embellish it for dramatic effect.
A great analogy. And speaking of embellishment, we can't talk about the Arthur legend without talking about Geoffrey of Monmouth. His 12th century work, History of the Kings of Britain, basically cemented the image of Arthur that we know today.
Right, he's the one who gives us Excalibur, Camelot, Merlin, the whole shebang.
Exactly. Now, even back then, people recognized that Geoffrey was playing a little fast and loose with the historical facts. But his book was a massive hit, spreading the Arthur legend far and wide and shaping how people viewed the past.
It's a reminder that sometimes impact can trump accuracy when it comes to shaping cultural narratives. So we've got these intriguing early mentions, but also plenty of reasons to be skeptical. But what about some more tangible evidence? Let's shift gears and talk about what archaeology can tell us about the world Arthur would have lived in.
Excellent point. Let's dig into the physical remains of the past and see if they offer any clues about the man behind the myth.
Because who doesn't love digging into a good archaeological mystery? What have the archaeologists been unearthing? Any sign of Excalibur?
Not quite. But they have found some fascinating things at Tintagel, that dramatic site on the Cornish coast often linked to Arthur's birth in later legends. You know how much I love a good origin story.
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm.
Especially when it involves a place as evocative as Tintagel. What have they found there that might shed light on Arthur's world?
Well, for a long time, Tintagel was thought to be the site of an early Celtic monastery, based on excavations done in the 1930s. But more recent digs, led by archaeologist Wyn Scott, have painted a much more intriguing picture.
Okay, well, I'm on the edge of my seat. What did they find?
Get this. Luxury goods from all over the Mediterranean, Spanish glass, French cups, even Tunisian pottery. Not exactly what you'd expect to find in a supposedly isolated and impoverished Dark Ages outpost.
Wow, Tunisia. That's incredible. It suggests a level of connection and trade that we don't typically associate with that period. Does this mean Arthur was sipping wine from a Tunisian goblet at Tintagel?
We can't say for sure, but it certainly paints a much more complex and vibrant picture of post-Roman Britain than we used to have.
It's like suddenly this whole world opens up, filled with unexpected connections and cultural exchanges.
And it raises the possibility that Tintagel was a significant power center, perhaps even ruled by someone like Arthur.
Speaking of power centers, we also have to talk about South Cadbury Castle, sometimes called Cadbury Camelot. It's an Iron Age hill fort with signs of major refortification in the 5th and 6th centuries, right when Arthur would have been around.
Exactly. And not only that, but excavations have revealed a large hall at the site, leading some to speculate that this was a major gathering place, maybe even a royal court.
A royal court. Now that sounds promising. Could it have housed a substantial military force? Perhaps even Arthur's legendary knights?
It's certainly possible. Or perhaps it served as a refuge for people fleeing Saxon attacks, adding another layer of complexity to the site's story. Either way, it gives us a glimpse into a society grappling with conflict and change a society that might have been ripe for a hero like Arthur to emerge.
It seems like with each archaeological discovery, we're getting closer to understanding the real world that shaped the Arthur legend. What other sites offer clues about this turbulent period?
Well, there's Cadbury Congressbury, which might have been an administrative center. This suggests a degree of social organization that challenges the stereotypical view of the Dark Ages as a period of utter chaos and decline. And then there's Castle Dor, which is interesting because it's linked to the Tristan and Isolde story.
Ah, love triangle for the ages. But wait, is that story connected to the Arthurian world?
It is. Tristan is often depicted as one of Arthur's knights in later versions of the legend. So the fact that Castle Dor dates back to the 5th or 6th century suggests that even in Arthur's supposed time, these tales of romance and intrigue were already circulating.
It's fascinating to think that some of the foundational stories that we still tell today, stories about love, loss, courage, and betrayal, have roots that stretch back so far.
Absolutely, and it's something we'll come back to later when we talk about the enduring power of the Arthur legend as a whole.
But before we get to that, we have to address the elephant in the room, archaeologically speaking. Glastonbury Abbey. It's the legendary Isle of Avalon, where Arthur was supposedly taken to heal after his final battle.
Yes, Glastonbury. It's a place that holds almost mythical status for those who believe in the Arthurian legend. But here's the thing. There's no archaeological evidence to support the Arthurian connection at the abbey itself.
So are we saying Glastonbury is a bust?
Hmm?
No magical healing powers or hidden tombs?
Not necessarily. Remember, absence of evidence.
Is not evidence of absence. You've drilled that into me. So what does this mean for Glastonbury?
While the abbey itself might not hold any Arthurian secrets, there is a fortified settlement nearby that dates to the right period. It's a reminder that even in the most well-trodden historical landscapes, there are still discoveries to be made.
We've spent the first part of our deep dive wading through historical accounts and archaeological digs, trying to piece together the puzzle of whether King Arthur was a real person or simply a legend. But now let's turn our attention to something just as fascinating. Why does this story, after all these centuries, still resonate so strongly with us?
Yeah, it's a question that has puzzled scholars and storytellers alike for generations. I think the answer lies in the way the Arthur legend taps into some very fundamental human needs and desires.
So what are some of those core themes or ideas that make the Arthur story so enduring?
Well, for one, you have this theme of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Remember, Arthur supposedly emerges at a time when Britain is in utter turmoil, the Roman order has collapsed, Saxon invaders are pouring in, and there's this pervasive sense of chaos and despair.
Yeah, some of the sources we discussed earlier almost paint a post-apocalyptic picture of Britain during that period.
It's a great comparison, and in that kind of environment, it's only natural for people to crave a hero, someone who can stand up to the darkness and inspire hope. Arthur, whether real or imagined, becomes that symbol, a beacon of strength in a time of vulnerability.
It's the classic hero's journey, isn't it? Rising from obscurity to meet a seemingly impossible challenge. And it's a story that seems to resonate across cultures and time periods. We see it in ancient myths, in modern superhero movies, and of course in the Arthur legend.
Exactly. It's that universal desire for someone to lead us out of the darkness, to restore order, to fight for what's right. But Arthur is more than just a warrior. He's also portrayed as a just and compassionate leader. He establishes a code of chivalry, a set of values that emphasizes honor, loyalty, and protection of the weak.
It's interesting, though, because chivalry as a concept didn't really exist in Arthur's supposed time. It was more of a medieval invention, something that developed centuries later.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It shows how the Arthur legend is constantly evolving, adapting to the values and concerns of different eras. As society changed, so did Arthur. He became a reflection of the ideals of the time.
So in a way, Arthur is like a mirror reflecting back the hopes and anxieties of each generation that retells his story.
Exactly, and that's one of the reasons why he's been so enduring. He's not a static figure stuck in a particular historical moment. He's constantly being reinterpreted, reimagined, made relevant for new audiences.
We see this in the way different writers and artists have portrayed him over the centuries, right?
Absolutely. Think about it. Geoffrey of Monmouth gives us this grand, almost mythical love. Arthur Chrétien de Troyes introduces the elements of courtly love and the quest for the Holy Grail, adding a layer of romance and spiritual seeking to the story. Then you have Thomas Malory writing centuries later, who adds a layer of tragedy and moral complexity. And even in the modern era, you have interpretations like T.H. White's The Once and Future King, which explores themes of pacifism and the corrupting nature of power.
It's amazing how one figure can inspire such a diverse range of interpretations.
And I think that speaks to the heart of the legend's enduring power. Each interpretation speaks to something deep within us, whether it's a yearning for strong leadership, a desire for romantic love, a search for spiritual meaning, or even a grappling with the complexities of morality and power.
It seems like each generation finds something different in Arthur, something that speaks to their own unique anxieties and aspirations.
And that's why the debate about whether he was real or not is almost beside the point. The power of the story lies in its ability to connect with us on an emotional level, to tap into something timeless and universal about the human experience.
So it's less about historical fact and more about the truths that the story reveals about human nature.
I think so. The Arthur legend speaks to our longing for order in the midst of chaos, for hope in the face of despair, and for a leader who can embody our highest ideals.
And it's a story that has been used throughout history to explore a wide range of ideas and beliefs, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Arthur has been invoked to legitimize rulers, to promote national identity, even to inspire social and political movements. Take the Victorian era, for example.
A time of massive social and technological change when people were grappling with a rapidly shifting world.
Exactly. And in that context, Arthur became a symbol of stability, of a romanticized past filled with chivalry and order. He was used to promote ideas about gentlemanly conduct and to reinforce traditional gender roles.
It's fascinating how the same story can be used to support such different agendas depending on the context.
That's the nature of myth. It's flexible, adaptable, and always open to reinterpretation. But even though the interpretations might change, there's something about the core of the Arthur story that seems to transcend time and culture.
So how do you explain Arthur's staying power in the modern world? We're far removed from the medieval world of knights and castles, yet his story still seems to resonate with us.
It's a great question. And I think in many ways we're still drawn to those same core themes, the desire for leadership, for heroism, for meaning in a world that can often feel chaotic and uncertain.
Especially in times of crisis, it seems like people turn to stories like Arthur's for comfort and inspiration.
It's like a collective yearning for something bigger than ourselves, for something to believe in that can offer hope and guidance.
It's a fascinating paradox, isn't it? We're drawn to this story about a legendary figure from a distant past, and yet it somehow still feels relevant to our modern lives.
I think that's the magic of the Arthur legend. It speaks to something timeless within us, something that transcends the boundaries of history and culture.
So if we had to sum up everything we've learned so far in this deep dive, what are the key takeaways about Arthur?
Well, I think we can safely say that the Arthur of legend, the king with Excalibur, Camelot, and the Knights of the Round Table, that Arthur is almost certainly a product of literary invention, a figure who evolved over centuries of storytelling.
Right. A lot of the details we associate with Arthur were added long after his supposed time, shaped by the imaginations of poets and writers who were responding to the concerns of their own eras.
But that doesn't mean there wasn't a real Arthur, a historical figure who inspired those later stories. Given the evidence we've discussed, it seems likely that there was some kind of warrior or leader in 5th or 6th century Britain who made a name for himself.
He might not have been a king, but he was probably someone who embodied those ideals of courage, leadership, and resistance that we still admire today.
Exactly. And the fact that his story got embellished over time just goes to show how powerful those ideals were and how much people needed a hero to believe in.
It's a reminder that history is often as much about storytelling as it is about facts and dates. It's about the narratives we create to make sense of the past and to find meaning in our own lives.
Beautifully said. The Arthur legend is ultimately a testament to the power of storytelling, to the way stories can shape our beliefs, inspire our actions, and connect us across time and culture.
Okay, so we've covered the history, the archaeology, the themes, but before we wrap up, I have to ask, what about the Holy Grail? Where does that fit into all of this?
Ugh, the Grail. That's a whole other deep dive for another day. But the short answer is that it's a later addition to the Arthur legend introduced by Chrétien de Troyes in the 12th century.
So not part of the original story.
No, but it quickly became one of the most popular and enduring elements of the Arthurian mythos. It represents this idea of a spiritual quest, a search for something sacred and transformative. And just like Arthur himself, the Grail has been interpreted in countless ways over the centuries.
It's a symbol that's taken on a life of its own. Which makes me think, even though we've debunked some of the myths and explored the historical context, there's still a sense of mystery surrounding Arthur.
Absolutely, and that's part of what keeps the legend alive. It invites us to keep searching, to keep questioning, to keep exploring the fascinating world of history and myth.
So what does all of this mean for you, the listener? Why should you care about the story of King Arthur? What can we take away from this deep dive that might be relevant to our own lives?
It's a question I always ask myself when I'm delving into history. What's the relevance, the connection to our lives today? And with Arthur, I think it comes down to his story, whether it's rooted in fact or fiction, is a story about the human spirit's ability to overcome adversity, to strive for something better, and to never give up hope, even in the darkest of times.
It's a message that resonates as strongly today as it did centuries ago.
Absolutely, and perhaps that's the most enduring legacy of King Arthur, the reminder that even in a world of chaos and uncertainty, there's always room for heroism, for compassion, and for the pursuit of something greater than ourselves.
We've journeyed back to 5th and 6th century. Britain explored the historical and archaeological evidence, and even delved into the psychology of why we're still so drawn to the story of King Arthur. But before we wrap up our deep dive, I want to touch on something that's been swirling in my mind throughout this whole conversation. We've talked about how the Arthur legend has been reinterpreted and reshaped over centuries. But there seems to be this core essence, this archetype, that persists through all the different versions.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's like there's this magnetic force at the center of the Arthur story, something that draws us in and speaks to us on a deep, almost primal level.
So what is that essence? What makes Arthur Arthur?
Well, I think it's this captivating blend of strength and compassion, of warrior and leader. He's not just a brute force conqueror. He's someone who inspires loyalty and devotion because he's perceived as just fair and ultimately fighting for a greater good. It's that potent combination that elevates him beyond just a warrior and transforms him into a symbol of true leadership.
He represents the kind of idealized ruler, someone who is both powerful and ethical, someone who wields power responsibly and acts with integrity. It's an image that has resonated throughout history, hasn't it?
Absolutely. And it's especially appealing in times when people are longing for stability, for guidance, for someone to believe in.
It's interesting because even though Arthur is often associated with the past, with this romanticized vision of medieval England, there's something about his story that feels incredibly relevant to the challenges we face in the modern world.
I completely agree. We live in a world that's increasingly complex and uncertain, a world grappling with global threats, political divisions, and social unrest. It's easy to feel overwhelmed and powerless in the face of such enormous challenges. And in that kind of environment, I think it's only natural to look for leaders who can inspire us, who can offer a sense of hope and direction, who embody those Arthurian qualities of strength, compassion, and integrity.
It's almost like a subconscious yearning for a return to a simpler time, a time when good and evil were clearly defined, and heroes like Arthur could vanquish the darkness.
It's a powerful archetype that speaks to our deepest longings for order and justice. And even though we know that the real world is rarely that simple, the Arthur story still has this incredible ability to tap into our emotions, to make us believe, at least for a little while, that there's still hope for a better future.
So where does that leave us? After all this digging into history, archaeology, and the evolution of the Arthur legend, what's the final verdict?
Well, I think it's safe to say that we'll probably never know for sure if there was a real Arthur, a historical figure who walked the earth in 5th or 6th century Britain. The evidence is too fragmented, too open to interpretation. But I think that's part of what makes the story so captivating. It invites us to engage with the past, to grapple with the ambiguities of history, and to draw our own conclusions.
The mystery remains, but perhaps that's the point. It sparks our curiosity and keeps the legend alive.
Exactly. And ultimately, I think the power of the Arthur legend lies not in its historical accuracy, but in its enduring ability to inspire us, to challenge us, and to remind us of our own capacity for courage, compassion, and leadership. It's a story that transcends time and place, speaking to something fundamental about what it means to be human.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of King Arthur, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought-provoking question. If you could travel back to 5th or 6th century Britain, what evidence would you look for to prove or disprove the existence of Arthur? Could there be undiscovered archaeological sites, lost documents, or forgotten tales waiting to be unearthed? The mystery endures, and the search for Arthur continues. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating journey.